Salams from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi. You're watching the Daily Debrief. I'm Siddhantani, and on the show today, I'll be talking to our reporters about the ongoing assault on sexual and reproductive rights in the United States, 50 years after the landmark Roe versus Wade ruling, and of course, the movement against this onslaught. We talk about Palestine, where another village, predating the state of Israel, faces demolition. And a potential settlement is on the cards between South Korea and Japan on a long-standing forced labor dispute. But is it a solution or just letting Japan off the hook for its colonial-era crimes? First up, January 22nd, 2023 marked the 50th anniversary of the historic Roe versus Wade decision, which secured abortion rights for women in the US at the federal level. For almost 50 years, the decision prevented states with conservative legislators from barring millions of women across the country from accessing abortion rights. That was until the Supreme Court shocked the nation and the entire world by overturning the decision on the 24th of June 2022. This means that on the 50th anniversary of Roe, which in many ways was the culmination of decades of feminist organizing, women in conservative controlled states once again are left without any access to abortion at all. Natalia Marquez has been covering, among other stories, the fight for sexual and reproductive rights in America and joins us now for more on this story. Natalia, good to see you. You have a story out on People's Dispatch on our website, very vividly talking about what women are facing on the ground in the United States following the striking down of Roe. Tell us a little bit about the scenario, the quite horrific scenario actually, particularly in the Deep South in the US.
Right, yeah. So, a lot of states in the Deep South had trigger laws, which essentially meant that they were prepared already for the overturn of Roe. They had laws on the books that immediately once Roe was overturned, once abortion no longer was a federally protected right, they would just kick in and there would be essentially an automatic abortion ban in those states. Because of those laws and because of laws that have been passed more in the recent past, around 13 states right now, the vast majority in the South, are completely entirely ban abortion. Alabama has one of the most extreme abortion bans with no exceptions for rape or incest. Arkansas has the same exact law. So, this means that there's no exception for essentially anything. And as we know, there are many different circumstances that can lead to an abortion. And right now, it's, women in those states have to cross state lines in order to get abortion care. Abortion clinics that existed, although they were few and far between, they did help many women in the Deep South. They have shuttered, they no longer provide abortion services. So, women in those states, if for whatever reason they need to save their own lives, right? They need abortions because they need to save their own lives in case of any sort of complications, or they were victims of rape or incest or what have you. They cannot get abortions in around 13 states in the United States. So circumstances are very dire.
And which, of course, hits those who are working the hardest, the most marginalized communities, the hardest, Black and Hispanic populations, because traveling, of course, across state lines means you have to take time off from work, which is not always possible and leads to other kinds of complications. Natalia, if we can sort of, in the recent midterms, we saw some surprising sort of ballot measures going through and things like that. How is the feminist movement and movements for sexual and reproductive rights, how are they organizing 50 years on from Roe to kind of, turn the clock back on the overturning?
Yes. So, in the midterm elections in November, we saw something really incredible. So every single time that abortion was put to a popular vote, either through some sort of ballot measure or referendum or what have you, abortion rights were secured. So people either voted against anti-abortion measures or voted for pro-abortion measures, even in conservative states. And so this proves really that abortion is a popular thing, right? Most people in the US overwhelmingly polls show this. Most people in the U.S. Support abortion and wanted abortion to stay legal. The decision to overturn Roe was not a popular vote. It was a Supreme Court ruling.
Mm.
And so feminist organizations are trying to get these measures on the ballot, and they're also trying to provide practical reproductive justice services on the ground. So Yellowhammer Fund, which is most active in Alabama and across the Deep South, you know, many of their services have become more difficult because we're providing, hundreds of abortion services either every month or every year, but they were providing a lot of abortion services, and now they can't obviously do any of that. And so are thinking of moving out of state, or even just telling women how they can access abortion services. This has become really difficult because of what's called aiding and abetting laws. So many states criminalize aiding or abetting abortion, making it at all easier for women to access abortions, telling women where to buy medication, abortion pills, anything of that nature. But Yellowhammer Fund might shift back to doing such things because those actions of just telling women where they can get an abortion could be protected under the First Amendment, under free speech. And yeah, also feminist organizations are trying to build a grassroots movement, initiating marches or actions at the local level, trying to combat, anti-abortion measures, local ordinances, what have you, in conservative states. And just, building on the ground, a mass movement, because Roe v. Wade, in 1973 was a decision that came about after a massive women's movement combined with a Black liberation movement, combined with other movements, etc. It was really it was a grassroots effort without that background, the historical background of the mass movements of the 60s. Roe v. Wade wouldn't have passed ever, or it would never have been ruled on. And so, feminist organizations are also trying to build that sort of energy on the ground to either, overturn Dobbs or in some way try to secure federally protected abortion rights through legislation. Abortion rights were never secured through, the legislative measure, which is why the Supreme Court was able to just very easily overturn those rights. But it's possible through things like abolishing the filibuster to pass abortion laws and make them federally secured and enshrined into law.
Right. A long process, it seems, Natalia. Finally, and maybe a little bit quickly if possible, this is in the end a serious public health issue that will have long-term consequences on America's health. Is there also strong support from public health movements?
Yes, I think that in the United States, nurses organizations or public health worker organizations are often labor. And labor, has supported this issue, but I think that in the US, labor is not necessarily as politically involved in non-labor issues or issues that don't directly relate to workers' rights or working conditions or whatnot. There are nurses unions and things like that, those types of organizations that are very active on the labor front, but not necessarily on the political front. And that is sort of the case with unions in the US in general. They don't really intervene in political issues. It's actually illegal in the US for workers to strike for political reasons or for reasons that don't have to do with, wages or working conditions or what have you. So it's very difficult for workers' organizations, public health worker organizations to really intervene in that way. And also unions in the US have a history of being depoliticized, made less political over time. And so, I hope to see that more in the future. I think that would make the most sense. I'm sure there's a lot of nurses and doctors and public health workers that do, in their hearts support abortion rights, because abortion is really a life and death issue for women. Women without access to abortion, women die in pregnancy complications. So I'm sure, there's a lot of popular support, and maybe that's something that we could see in the future. But right now, the support is primarily coming from, workers that are unorganized or feminist organizations or nonprofits or that sort of thing. But, I hope to see that in the future, possibly.
All right. Thanks very much, Natalia, for your time today. Palestinians are protesting threats and moves by top Israeli politicians belonging to Benjamin Netanyahu's hard-right government to imminently carry out the forced displacement of the Palestinian Bedouin village of Khan al-Ahmar on the eastern outskirts of Jerusalem. Khan al-Ahmar is home to at least 180 people, many of them children, and the Israeli state has been planning the demolition of the village since at least 2010. The protest took place on Monday after far-right politician and Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir said he would push ahead with the village's forced removal, and plans emerged of a visit to the site by far-right ministers. Abdul has been following the story and joins us via video conference with more details. Abdul, always good to have you on the Daily Debrief. Khan al-Ahmar, located just to the east of Jerusalem, the target this time for Israeli demolitions. There's a legal argument being made, which we can get into a little bit later about the details of this case itself. But just in terms of the events on the ground, if you could tell us what has been the latest. Some of the most hard-right politicians in the current Netanyahu administration were threatening to actually go to the location, and that really sparked off the protests.
Well, you rightly pointed out, basically, Itamar Ben-Gvir and his coalition partner, the larger group of the settler movement leaders, the so-called leaders of the settler movement, they basically found an opportunity to put their agenda in front. And it was basically the demolition of repeated demolition, second time demolition of an outpost called Sham. In near Khan and al-Ahmar, basically, and that basically created a kind of a possibility for them to compare it with the Palestinians, who they claim that they are living there illegally because this is Area C, and so on and so forth. They have built the village without any legal permit, and so, as you rightly pointed out, and that basically became they tried to take a moral high ground, saying that the current Israeli government, the government led by Benjamin Netanyahu, does not discriminate between the Arabs and the Jews. And if the Jews, the law is same for them. If the Jews can be ousted from their homes because they did not follow certain laws, so that the Palestinians. And that was the reason that kind of basically a baseless comparison between the Palestinians and the Israeli settlers basically created a situation, created a tense situation, which of course one should also see that there is a tussle in the government also. There is a Likud which has always championed the right wing of the Israeli politics, and there is Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is basically trying to capture the similar constituency. So it is the race between two right-wing, ultra-right-wing groups. Who is more radical than other, and that basically led to two of the Likud MPs protesting in front of outside the Palestinian village, which basically incited Ben-Gvir's comments. So it seems that the race in the Israeli politics has created a situation where Palestinians are being sacrificed to prove their right-wing credentials. And that rumor, because ultimately Ben-Gvir did not visit Khan al-Ahmar and neither of his coalition partners, except for these two MPs of the Likud, basically led a protest by the Palestinians on Tuesday, who sat on a whistle outside the village, claiming that they will not let the demolition happen. And if they demolish the village 100 times, they will rebuild it. And that was the place with which the Palestinians sat on a whistle outside the Khan al-Ahmar, and that is the basis on which this particular set of events unfolded.
All right. Tell us a bit. You rightly pointed out, Abdul, that in all of this political grandstanding and the race to the far right, it is Palestinians, and in this case, Palestinian Bedouins who are the victims. Tell us a bit more about this case. It's not a new story. Khan al-Ahmar is something that has been on the anvil for the Israeli state since back in 2010 at least.
Yeah. So basically, the basic facts of the case are quite clear. Basically, it is Israel's larger attempt to displace Palestinians from the occupied West Bank, as much of Palestinian land as they can grab for whatever excuse they can invent. So with this particular larger political agenda in mind, in 2010, Israeli state claimed that this particular village was built without the required permits from the Israeli state. We should know that there are three major areas in occupied West Bank created after the Oslo Accord, A, B, and C. And Area C, which is the largest part of the occupied West Bank, is where Israeli state has almost complete control. So any construction needs the permission from the Israeli state. But Palestinians have claimed that this village is older than the Israeli state. So this particular requirement of permit does not work. Nevertheless, Israeli state claimed that this is an illegal village and they wanted to remove it, with the agenda, of course, was to expand the existing Malay Udumbin, one of the largest illegal settlements inside West Bank, and expand it and merge it with the Greater Jerusalem, which is the project taken by the right-wing Israeli governments in order to kind of somehow amend the boundaries of the occupied East Jerusalem, so that ultimately Jerusalem becomes it becomes difficult if there is any final settlement to have a claim over the status of Jerusalem. So with that objective and with this legal argument, they went to the Israeli Supreme Court, which finally, after a long legal battle, first the demolition was stayed. Then the houses were demolished. Palestinians rebuilt the houses, and then the case went on into the Israeli court. Finally, in 2018, the Israeli Supreme Court, again, as in Masafer Yatta last year, gave the permission for the demolition of the Palestinian houses, which is around 180 residents live. Most of them, as you rightly pointed out, are Bedouins, live there, and half of them are children, by the way. And so this was the larger thing. Palestinian Authority, by the way, has claimed, as I said before, that this village is older than the Israeli state, and this particular attempt of demolition will not be allowed to be successful. International Criminal Court in 2018 itself had opined, not the court per se, but the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court had opined that such act will be considered as a violation of the international laws related to occupation and will be a war crime. Nonetheless, Israel does not care about international laws and international institutions, and this particular event is a renewed attempt to complete the agenda.
Another example of that. All right, thanks for that update, Abdul, as well as providing a context in which to view it. Thank you. And finally, a breakthrough of sorts seems on the cards in a long-standing labor dispute between Japan and Korea, covering the period between 1910 and 1945, when the Korean peninsula was colonized by Japan. The Japanese government's official stand has been that all such disputes were completely and finally settled, according to a 1965 bilateral agreement. But now there seems a possibility of a compromise in which both sides will participate, and whereby plaintiffs suing for compensation for their or their kin's labor to Japanese firms during the period might receive the same, via donations from both sides, of course. But is this an actual solution to the problem, or just letting Japan off the hook? Anish joins us now. He's been covering the story and knows the region very well and has all the details, including the context. Anish, good to see you again. For my benefit, as well as I think for many of our viewers, Anish, could you give us the context into this labor dispute between South Korea and Japan to begin with, before we get into the proposed solutions?
Yeah, so let's begin with the fact that for the better half, or the first half of the 20th century, the whole of the Korean Peninsula was under Japanese colonial rule, and under that period, we actually saw uh, quite a lot of abuses in terms of, especially in terms of forced labor. It was more or less very similar to an imposed indentured labor or slavery, even in many cases. And there are pretty much major historical industrial sites in Japan that still bear witness to the kind of massive number of people that were pushed into the forced labor and under terrible conditions even, and some of which Japan is now trying to push as UNESCO heritage sites, very conveniently erasing some of these history of in forced labor in of Korean people in these camps and in these mines and in these industrial units and factories. And so during this period, definitely this was something that after the war, we know about the Treaty of San Francisco, which had multiple signatories, but very important parties that were excluded from it included Korea, either of the Koreas, be it North or the South, and China. And so with Korea, they had to go for a very separate kind of treaty in 1965 when they re-established diplomatic relations. And this 1965 treaty also had the Korean government at the time, a military government, a very right-wing military, pro-US government as well, we must add, securing about $800 million at the time in different forms of what they called as reparation fees, quote unquote reparation fees, which included loans and aid in the form of goods and services, and also around $300 million of loans for which were put into various massive companies, state and private, to essentially kickstart a sort of an economic renaissance at the time. So the Japanese government maintains that with the treaty, Korea has lost all rights to claim any kind of reparations for the war, because it has given, as I said, quote unquote reparation fees. Now, the issue is that for later records show that the Korean government also had secured some $300 or so million as part of wartime labor or forced labor of Koreans, and a compensation for that, including those who were killed for the families, and those who are survivors. And so, and which was not used for to deal with wartime labor, to compensate them. So these factors were also part of the thing. It also, we have to remember that the treaty does not talk about any of the abuses, individual abuses and human rights violations that Japan and Japanese forces and companies committed in Korea. That is something that does not come under the sovereign reparations of that Japan had paid for colonialism in Korea. These are things that the Korean judiciary very rightly pointed out is something that has to be separately dealt with and needs to be given reparations and apologies as a separate set of issues and incidents and cases. And so this is at the heart of this whole deal that we're talking about right now.
Right. So coming to that, or coming to current events, over the past couple of weeks, I think senior diplomats on both sides have been having these conversations, and some kind of a solution seems to be on the cards. Is that an accurate reading of it, or is it just a step in the direction?
Calling it a solution, let's begin with that, is kind of contentious, because many, both within Korea and Japan, see this as a way of Japan trying to escape its responsibility
Culpability.
of our culpability for the crimes that its companies, its government, its military had committed in Korea, which includes not just wartime labor, but also the massive issue of comfort women, which is a multinational issue. It's not something that is just, isolated to Korea. It happened in China, in Philippines, and so on. All the places that Japan had, committed or colonized during the war. So right now, the way the treaty is shaping out, the kind of solution that the conservative government is offering is basically to use the companies that received the loans, the sort of the reparation fees in the 1965 treaty, make them pay for a trust, a funding, which will then fund these sort of compensation. They call it compensation to the victims of forced labor, which is problematic because then it completely nullifies any kind of culpability and responsibility to the Japanese. So we do not know, we are not sure how it will finally go, but the direction that it is going to, it is basically just the conservative government, the pro-US government trying to let Japan off the hook for the crimes that it has committed in the peninsula.
So more of a political balancing act than anything else. Thanks very much for giving us sort of the background to this story as well as what exactly is going on, Anish. Right, with that, we bring to a close this episode of the Daily Debrief. As always, we invite you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for details on these stories and all the other work we do. Please do follow us on the regular social media platforms if you haven't done so already. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. Until then, goodbye.